We tend to think of cults as being incredibly secretive societies, closed off from the rest of the world. That isn't necessarily true of all cults, but some of the most dangerous have dark secrets that the rest of the world may never know. These are 5 cult mysteries. Number 5. Terry Hoffman, founder of the conscious development of body, mind, and soul, claimed to have spoken with God and angels from an early age, and she believed she was the reincarnation of a Catholic saint. She taught a mixture of Eastern and Western philosophies and the existence of karma. The cult believed that people led troubled lives due to evils in their past lives, but what those evils were depended on Terry's webs. It seemed innocent enough, but Terry invoked a paranoia in her followers that isolated them from their families. They believed beings called Black Lords were trying to destroy them and didn't trust medical doctors, which put their lives and their children's lives at risk. In the span of just 12 years, 11 people closely connected to Terry died. 6 commit suicide, 4 were classified as accidental deaths, and 1 was murdered. Many of those who died gave Terry their estate. One was the daughter of Terry's closest follower, who, according to her school friends, didn't like Terry and thought her mother's religious beliefs were crazy. However, she too left what money and belongings she had to Terry in a will written shortly before she drowned. Due to the high number of deaths, a criminal investigation was launched in 1990, but after 4 years, no concrete evidence could link Terry to the deaths. She was eventually imprisoned for fraud and died in 2015. Conscious development is now gone, but one mystery remains. Charles Southern Jr. was the assistant chairman of the English department at a junior college in Chicago in the 1980s. He was a major member of the local chapter of the cult and quickly rose through the ranks. Charles was invited to meet Terry in person, but her paranoia was off-putting. After his visit, his mental health deteriorated. His family found him in the street murmuring to himself and took him to the hospital as they thought he may be suicidal. When he recovered, he returned to work and his role in the Conscious Development Project. In December of 1987, he planned a trip to India over the Christmas break. Charles traveled often, so it didn't worry his family too much, but when he was overdue home, his parents grew worried. They broke into his home, where they found his passport, a hastily written will, a suicide note, and Nigerian tribal symbol of death. Charles's body has never been found, and it's not clear if he actually commits suicide. He's still classified as missing, and Terry denied any involvement in his disappearance. Number 4. Shelly Miscavige is not missing. At least so reads the story according to the Church of Scientology. A missing persons report filed to LAPD was described as unfounded and quickly closed by police. This has only made her absence even more mysterious. Shelly was for decades one of the faces of Scientology. She was the graceful wife of church leader David Miscavige. She attended every event with her husband up until August of 2007. Since then, she hasn't been seen in public and there's no information of where she is. According to the church, she's still hard at work on a special project. According to defectors, she's likely at one of the church's isolated menial labor bases. Shelly has been involved in the church from the age of 12, and by the time she was 15, she was completely dedicated to the church founder. She and David began dating in 1978, and they married a few years later. Miscavige was also completely dedicated to the church, and in 1986, he became the leader. Shelly was given the job of assistant to the chairman of the board, her husband. According to the sources in the church, the relationship completely changed. They no longer acted as a husband and wife beyond photo ops. He was her boss and very little more. However, Shelly refused to be an accepting submissive to her husband, who was becoming more abusive to all of his inner circle. She worked as something like a diplomat between her and her husband's workers, trying to keep the peace while at the same time doing his bidding. In late 2006 and early 2007, going against her husband's wishes, she made some organizational changes and boxed up some of his belongings. From that point on, she seemed to know she was living on borrowed time. Not long after, she disappeared without a trace. There were no Christmas messages to her friends within the church, and church members were shut down when they tried to ask about her. The church completely denies Shelly is missing, or that her husband has anger problems. This is unlikely to change anytime soon. Number 3. The death of Bethany Deaton was no doubt caused by the untreated mental health issues of two young people whose whole life had revolved around their religion and their faith in God. Whether or not Bethany committed suicide or was killed by another, and how much direct involvement the cult she belonged to had, remains a mystery. She was found dead in the back of a minivan with a bag tied around her head. It was less than 2 months after she married the man she'd fallen in love with at college years earlier. But a suicide note and empty pill bottles found in the van indicated this was her own doing. Tyler Deaton, her husband, was the charismatic leader of a cult-like splinter group of the International House of Prayer. He was able to manipulate the followers in his group, known as the Community, to gang up on anyone who disagreed with him. This included longtime friends and his wife. While Bethany seemed happy and in love during her wedding just a few months earlier, that hadn't lasted long into the honeymoon. Tyler struggled with his sexuality, having been raised in a very religious house, and couldn't bring him to consummate the marriage. Many commented that he and Bethany seemed more like a brother and sister than a man and wife, and Bethany was not happy with this relationship. It seemed like all this, combined with her own failing mental health, had triggered a suicide, and the death was ruled as such. That is, until another member of the group confessed to her murder. Micah Moore had been friends with Bethany since college and moved to join Tyler's group after he graduated. He was completely dedicated to the cause and told police he drugged Bethany and tied the bag around his head. The confession included many details that seemed to fill in gaps in the suicide story, but at the same time, many of the details were wrong, and he later retracted the confession. IHOP claimed to have no knowledge of Deaton's group, which was exposed as controlling and abusive, but it was these members who had later exorcised Micah shortly before he confessed. Years after the confession, charges that had been brought against Micah were dropped. Along with the discrepancies in his statement, there was no evidence he'd been in the van at all. Officially, Bethany's death is classified as undetermined. With so many factors, it's unlikely the truth about what happened to Bethany will ever come out, nor how involved the IHOP actually was in her death. Number 2. For some, MOVE would not be classified as a cult. It's a Philadelphia-based group which claims to focus on Black nationalism and returning to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. However, for those with loved ones who belong to this communal living organization, and those that left it, the controlling nature, at least in the group's peak of notoriety between the 1970s and 80s, fits the definition of a cult. The group was founded by John Africa in 1972, but it reached infamy around a decade later after 2 brushes with the police. The first was a shootout in 1978, in which a police officer was killed. The second came in 1985, when the police dropped a bomb on the group's compound, killing 11 people, including Africa himself. It was shortly after the bombing that John Gilbride became involved with the group. John's parents described him as unrebellious growing up, but that changed when he went to university, where he began to work with MOVE. He became dedicated to the group, moving into MOVE's headquarters, and in 1992, he married Alberta Africa, John Africa's widow. John spent thousands of dollars on fertility treatment so he and Alberta could have a child, and in 1996 she gave birth to a boy, John Zachary Gilbride. John and Alberta's marriage rapidly deteriorated after Zachary's birth, in part due to meddling from the cult. 2 years after Zachary was born, John had had enough and filed for divorce. A court permitted John unsupervised visits, something Alberta and MOVE would not stand for. They claimed John was abusive and a deadbeat father, and John began to fear for his life. In September of 2002, the day he was due to visit with his son, John was shot dead in an execution-style killing. John's family believe MOVE was behind the execution, and some ex-members have come forward to claim this is true, but there's been little in the way of evidence, and nobody has been convicted of the killing. Meanwhile, Alberta and her organization have claimed both that the government was responsible for his death and framed the group, and that John wasn't killed at all and was hiding somewhere. Number 1. Unlike the other victims on this list, Maureen Dutton was not a member of any cult or secret society. She was an ordinary housewife, mother of 2 young sons, who was stabbed by a mystery assailant in December of 1961. A fake doctor, a strange murmuring woman, and a handsome young man were all tied to the case, but no suspects were ever named and the murder weapon was never found. Maureen's husband found her body when he came home from work. Their 2-year-old son and baby sat nearby. Neither of the children had been hurt, nothing had been stolen, and Maureen had not been sexually assaulted. With no murder weapon and no motive, the investigation hit a dead end. After the murder made the news, a young woman who lived nearby came forward with possibly valuable information. She, like Maureen, had recently given birth and was visited by a man claiming to be a doctor. She thought nothing of the doctor visiting, but his inappropriate behavior made her husband suspicious and he contacted the hospital. No doctor matched this description and the couple reported his visit as assault. Given there was no sign of forced entry at Maureen's home, it was suggested the same doctor had tricked his way into her home and attacked. Another possible suspect was a mysterious, good-looking youth noticed by many of Maureen's neighbors the day she was murdered. He'd been hanging around the street Maureen lived on, and later that afternoon was seen running down the street and violently throwing up at the steps of a church. He kept his hand in his pockets the entire time. The third unidentified suspect was a young Irish woman. She boarded a bus near the crime scene and spent the journey muttering about how she'd done something terrible and needed to get away. She caught a train and was never seen again. It was suggested all 3 may have been working together to kill Maureen as part of a cult sacrifice. It was believed a Polynesian cult operated in the area and made sacrifices during the solstice. The suggestion was mostly disregarded, but with no answers having emerged in the 50 years since her death, some question whether Maureen may have been killed by a cult. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.